Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. So this session is on supercharging your front-end developer experience with Vite. So for people who don't know, I'm Chris Heinrich. I work at Markov as a front-end engineer. So recently we were looking to migrate our Create-React app-based project to Vite. So I'll share some of the learnings that I had along that and some of the cautionary advice I can impart. So let's get started. So we'll start with just the overview of the session. We'll kind of introduce Create-React app for people who don't know already. I'm assuming most people here are probably familiar, but we'll kind of go over what that is and how it works. We'll also look at Vite, which is kind of an alternative build tool, and see how it's different from Create-React app and what advantages it provides. We'll kind of go over like a high-level migration plan. So if you have an existing Create-React app project, we'll look at how you might migrate that, as well as discussing some of the obstacles that you're probably likely to face. And then we'll kind of tie that all together and try to answer the question, should I bother trying to migrate my existing Create-React app-based project? And I think we won't use up the whole 45 minutes, so we'll have some time at the end for questions as well. So we'll start with just some context, looking at what Create-React app is. So Create-React app, or CRA, as it's commonly called, it's basically a very convenient tool if you're trying to start a React project and just get up and running. So for the people who aren't front-end engineers, like React as a library lets you build views. The kind of bare bones implementation, it's very inconvenient to use. So people who use React like to use JSX, which is a syntax that looks kind of like XML. It basically lets you define custom web components and their behaviors. But getting started with React is a little painful sometimes, especially if you want testing, you want to use modern JavaScript features, and so on. So Create-React app basically gives you a single command. It lets you bootstrap your project, and it gives you a bunch of nice things out of the box. So like build tool is all configured for you. It gives you a Babel transpiler, which lets you use kind of modern and future JavaScript language features. Provides a test runner out of the box, opinionated folder structure, code linting, etc. So if you go to your command line, you can literally just type npx create-react app and whatever the name of the app you want to call it. You'll wait like a minute or so, and then it'll spit out your whole project, and you can get off to the races, basically. This tool, Create-React app, also provides some other options. So if you want to have, for example, a TypeScript project, you just pass some additional configuration. And under the hood, like if you look at the package JSON file that is generated, there's only a single dependency for the project. So it's called React Scripts, which is something that Facebook basically published. And it kind of abstracts away all the underlying dependencies. So from your point of view, there's like a single dependency. Everything is just kind of hidden away, and it's super nice to work with. You don't have to kind of worry about anything. And out of the box, you get a few handy NPM scripts. So npm start will start up your development server locally. It also comes with something called hot module reloading. So basically this is like watching your source files. Anytime there's a code change, it'll just automatically refresh. You don't have to do anything. The browser just updates. Very handy. npm run build will create an optimized production build. Usually this takes a little while, but it'll basically scan all your files, do all the minification, all the build steps, and spit out like a static site. Basically, you can just host. npm run test will initiate the test runner that's built in. So that's Jest with Create-React app. Jest is a test runner that Facebook developed. And if you need to kind of dig into the configuration and customize the project in ways that Create-React app doesn't support out of the box, they give you this other script called eject. And what eject does is basically, it takes that React scripts dependency and kind of unpacks it. So it's like opening the black box, pulling everything out, and then you can control and customize anything you want. Usually you don't need to do that, but if you need to, the option is there. So Create React App is super handy. It's very popular. I think a lot of people probably initiated their companies' projects with Create React App. Actually, yeah, show of hands, who uses a project that was bootstrapped with Create React App? Probably all the companies, right? So after a while, some problems do arise with Create React App, and especially kind of nowadays. So once your code base and the number of dependencies you have grows large, the dev server load time can actually become very slow. So these are actual screenshots from our app. So the first one is showing 20 seconds to build the thing. The second one, this is not very usual, but I have seen this come up where it's taking literally minutes just to run the dev server. And that's because there's hundreds or thousands of modules that it's kind of bundling, and you're literally blocked in and have to wait for all those things to get parsed and packed up. Also, building production builds, the time for that and hot module replacement as well can get noticeably slower. Usually hot module replacement is not anywhere near those build times, but it can be a few seconds at least just to see the code update. So over time, waiting so long can, it can actually translate into real costs for the business. Concretely developer time, right? If you're just blocked waiting for your thing to spin up, that's not good. And then frustration if you're encountering this all the time and having to wait. So let's try to understand why this happens exactly, because it is kind of a problem. And then we'll look at maybe how this might get fixed or improved. So why is Create React App getting so slow? So it's all about kind of how the under the hood, the JavaScript code is getting bundled, and that bundle is kind of getting loaded. So internally, Create React App uses Webpack, which is a code bundler. And it basically scans through your whole tree and packages up all the code. So for those who aren't familiar with front-end bundling, basically there are tools that kind of analyze your code. They crawl through all the dependency tree, and they process and concatenate all those modules into generally a single file, or depending if you're doing code splitting or different techniques, a few different files that the browser can then run directly. So this is a graphic from the Vite website that kind of shows nicely how this works. So you have some entry point, which is an index file in your source. Generally, people kind of split the code up by routes. So each page has associated code, and then those are kind of the top level modules from the entry point. And then from each route, there might be dozens or hundreds of submodules that get loaded. And each module might propagate and have submodules as well. So all of those things kind of need to get scanned, analyzed, and concatenated. That big result is called the bundle. And that's really what your development server or your production build is serving. So there's another quote from the Vite website which really explains the problem well. I'll just read it up here. So as we build more and more ambitious applications, the amount of JavaScript we're dealing with is also increasing dramatically. It's not uncommon for large-scale projects to contain thousands of modules. We are starting to hit a performance bottleneck for JavaScript-based tooling. It can often take an unreasonably long wait, sometimes up to minutes, to spin up a development server. And even with hot module replacement, file edits can take a couple of seconds to be reflected in the browser. The slow feedback loop can greatly affect developers' productivity and happiness. So it's a great summary of the problems I've just been discussing. The other issue with Create React App is recently it's kind of been abandoned by Facebook as the recommended tool to start a new project. So here's a little blurb about this. They're saying, this is kind of in the context of the new React documents that came out, React documentation that came out recently. And they no longer mention create React app or recommend it as part of that. So this popular tool was previously the recommended way to start a new React project, but it has since been deprecated by the React team. While create React app is still functional, developers are now encouraged to use alternative tools like Next and Remix or Vite. And if you're curious about why that is, there's this interesting GitHub pull request. Basically, if you read the comments and the tweet that's mentioned in the post here, this kind of goes into some reasons why people are trying to move away from create React app. So what's the solution? Like, what is the alternative that we can use instead? So I have to qualify the solution here by saying this may be the solution. It kind of depends on a lot of things, but we'll kind of elucidate that a little bit. So Vite is a very popular alternative, and there's a lot of kind of exciting things it's promising to do that I think for front-end developers facing the problems of Webpack and create React app, it seems like the dream, essentially. So what is Vite exactly? So Vite, which is a French word meaning quick, it's a bundle-less dev tool that works with React and other frameworks. And its purpose is to provide a faster and leaner development experience for modern web projects. And the Vite package is comprised of two main parts. So there's the dev server that provides rich feature enhancements over native ES modules. ES here is just ECMAScript. That's the formal name for JavaScript. So you can read that as JavaScript modules. For example, extremely fast hot module replacement. And then the other part is the build command that bundles the code up using another tool called rollup. And that's pre-configured to output highly optimized static assets. So those are kind of the two sub-components of Vite. So how does Vite work and what makes it so fast? So unlike create React app, Vite uses ES build internally for its development server. And then, like I mentioned, rollup for its production builds. So what is ES build? So ES build is a tool that makes bundling JavaScript accessible and very fast. Essentially, you can use ES build to quickly link your project's JavaScript and CSS dependencies as deployable assets for the web. And this is kind of a sales pitch from the website, but Vite pre-bundles dependencies using ES build, which is written in Go. And pre-bundled dependencies are 10 to 100 times faster than JavaScript-based bundlers. And if you're curious about Vite, like if you go to their main website, there's one of the top sections called Why. That has a really good explanation of kind of the motivation behind Vite, kind of the central ideas, and it goes into more detail than I'm able to in this session. So check that out if you have time. So in Vite, hot module replacement is performed over native ES modules. So how this works is when a file is edited, Vite kind of does the minimal amount of work. It only needs to precisely invalidate that, that kind of, just the chain of modules that were edited, essentially. It doesn't have to rebuild the entire tree. So that's why the updates are so fast. It's basically just doing the minimum possible work versus doing everything, right? So this makes things scale much more easily. Like instead of having build time scale with the size of the application, you can have like a huge application and you're going to see consistently fast speeds. Mm-hmm.
So when you say close it, HMR boundary, does it mean like if I take something on index.js or something like that, will it affect the whole sort of thing, or is it like the dependency chain or something?
It's the dependency chain, right? So so concretely, usually you're editing things more at the leaf level of if you're imagining a tree. It's much farther down when you're doing like individual components or something. So it's only those components and their direct parents that would have to be replaced. So here's the graphic for how this works. So basically the server can start up, and then like depending on the route that you're viewing, it's only needing to load like the minimal set of modules for the current view. So as you navigate around, it would kind of load different pieces of the app on demand. So this makes it very, very snappy in comparison to the large-scale bundle approach. So Vite also has a plugin architecture. So the core of Vite is quite minimal. And then if you want to integrate Vite with different types of tooling or different types of dependencies, usually you'd be configuring plugins with Vite. And I'll pull this up quickly, but there are a number of official plugins for Vite and then a number of third-party plugins. So just to kind of go over a few. For example, there's a Vite plugin for Node, for linting, all these kind of different packages you might want to configure. There's quite a lot. Each thing is kind of supposed to be atomic and very, very focused. So in practice, you end up using a lot of these if you're trying to migrate like a mature project. But this was a nice resource I came across that kind of lists all the most common plugins that you might use. So this is a repo that's maintained by Vite. It's just called Awesome Vite. In addition to plugins, it has some documentation, some getting started things. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested. Okay, so let's now look at the promise of Vite. So if you think of Create React App as kind of something that's powerful but bulky, let's say, you might think of it as like a big pickup truck, right? So it's very full-featured. You can kind of just take the keys and drive away, and it's ready to haul. It's ready to do all of your work. You don't have to, do much. So very convenient, but it is bulky. It does slow down when it's like loaded up. In contrast to that, Vite you can think of maybe as like a speedy motorcycle or something. It's very lean, trying to do the minimum work and get things in at like blazing speed, right? But there is a disclaimer. So this seems great. However, when you have an existing project and you're trying to migrate to Vite, a lot of times this is kind of the experience. So you've loaded up your project with all these dependencies, and it's fine. It's hauling them well, but now you're trying to move to Vite, and it gets a little tricky. So there's a lot of finagling you have to do to get everything kind of working well together. And we'll explore that a little bit more. So let's talk about kind of what the high-level picture of migrating to Vite from a Create React App-based project would look like. So you can kind of follow the flowchart here, but basically there is a general migration process, which we'll go over shortly. It's around like 9 or 10 steps. Additionally, if your project has, for example, TypeScript or styled components or different things like that, there's probably additional migration steps that you would anticipate kind of having to do. And step 3 is really where I think most of the time would be spent. So in my experience and what I've come across online a lot is like people get stuck. Vite will complain about various dependencies or various conventions or ways things have been imported, for example. And there might be like a non-trivial amount of refactoring or troubleshooting that you have to do. So ideally, you repeat the troubleshooting until things finally start working. You're able to run your development server locally. You're able to get a production build and also run your tests. And at that point, congratulations, you've migrated. But there will be step 3. So let's talk about kind of the general steps. So you have a Create React package. How do you start moving to Vite? So step 1 would be install Vite and any related packages that you anticipate you'll need. So Vite, the Vite package is kind of the base. And if you have a React project, you'll definitely need the Vite.js/plugin React. Commonly, you'll use SVGs in your React project. So I've included here Vite plugin SVGR, which basically lets you take SVGs and import them as React components and use them in your project. So again, Vite is the base package. The React plugin is the, gives compatibility with React, because Vite isn't React specific. So out of the box, you get support for JS, JSX, as well as TypeScript and TSX files. If you're looking at other migration guides, you might come across this other library called plugin React Refresh. That's kind of the old version that's been deprecated. So just keep an eye out for that. It's just plugin React now as the official package. And then again, Vite plugin SVGR, it allows you to import SVG files as React components. If you don't use SVGs in your project, then you can skip this one. So this is just kind of the base plugins and core package that you would expect. Most likely you'll need several additional plugins, depending on, again, what your project dependencies are. So once you've installed that, there's a few things you'll need to update in package.json. So your start and build scripts by default with create React app, those call the React scripts package. So those will need to be substituted for Vite commands. So to start your dev server, you literally just call Vite. It's nice, simple. To build, you'll call Vite build, and if you're using TypeScript, you have to compile first. So TypeScript and Vite build. If you're moving away from create React app, you won't need the eject script anymore, so you can remove that. And then the serve script, if you're using that, this may be something that create React app was referencing. So this would change now to just Vite preview. That would serve your bundle or serve your static asset. Yeah, so in Markov, we actually didn't need that change because we were using another package called serve already. It's, again, just to serve like the static asset that gets built. Finally, if your test script was using the built-in React scripts test command, you should update that. So there's a so Vite itself doesn't do test running. There's a separate package called vtest that you would then install. And the command is quite simple. You install the package, just call vtest, and it would work with just test out of the box. It also does code coverage, which is nice. So if you run vtest run coverage, you'd get a code coverage report generated. Okay, after you've updated your package.json, so Vite itself needs its own configuration file. This is basically where you're specifying any plugins that you want to integrate with. So you'd create a new file called vite.config.js in the project root. And I'll show an example of a bare bones configuration file. Again, you'll need like as many plugins as your dependencies require, but kind of minimally, this is what the config file would look like. So Vite itself provides this function define config. And then within that, you're just specifying certain fields. So the build field would say like, what directory do I want to spit out my production build in? And then plugins is going to be that place where you're defining all those plugins that you need. So you can see that React and SVGR plugin are defined on the top. Those are functions that get called within that plugins array. And then any configuration options you want to give to the individual plugins, those would be like objects that get passed as a parameter. Any questions so far? Yeah, Sage.
So for the adding plugins and the config file, so for this purpose, you're just talking about basically two. In your experience, how many was it actually? How many, give us a...
Yeah, it was like around 10 or so.
And
Yeah, so my approach was, like, I started with a couple guides online that were just discussing like these high-level steps, basically, that I'm talking about now. Once I implemented all that, I was running the commands, and Vite was complaining about a lot of things. So yeah, either those error messages were clear enough, and I understood like what plugin was missing, or I Googled around and then was able to find some information.
Is it playing nicely with Babel, or do you keep that?
Yeah, so it internally handles like JSX and TSX files. So in terms of like transforming that, there wasn't any additional work needed. I'm not sure for other features exactly that you would be using Babel for.
I have a question.
Yeah.
For the testing side, right, test is there, so were you able to run some tests? Because I want to understand, does it run well with, let's say, RTL, the testing library, or with Jest, or?
So actually, I'll describe issues with even getting the dev server to run. So I wasn't able to actually run tests. But we can test it, actually. It's not much code to set up, so. All right, and then if you're using TypeScript in your project, there's some additional type configuration needed. So in your TS config, a few things here are required for Vite. So the target and yeah, basically these fields that I've highlighted all need to kind of be specifically these values for Vite to work. So both module and target need to refer to ESNext. You need to have isolated modules on, and then you need to specify the types as shown here. I'm not 100% sure on exactly what these control, but this was from one of the migration guides I came across. So you'd have to refer to docs to get more information on these.
So I'm guessing the types that you've added are the types of the plugins.
Correct, yeah.
So
I think the first one is just for Vite itself. Okay, and then if your TypeScript uses path mapping, which basically it lets you avoid having, for example, like // // some file. You can just say like design system is my starting point, and I'm going to specify the path relative to that. That's path mapping. That will require another plugin, so that's called Vite tsconfig paths. And the plugin again just goes in that same array. So you just import it here. This is just the minimal example showing that one plugin. And again, any configuration options you don't want to pass would go in the parentheses there.
Chris, would that work if you're not using TypeScript?
This wouldn't be required if you're not using TypeScript.
Okay, so it's not the typical import. It's not the thing where you can reduce the number of subpaths for.
I would imagine there's a separate plugin if that's available outside of TypeScript.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so after the TypeScript changes, another change is to the index.html file itself. So instead of being located in the public directory where create React app places it by default, it needs to move actually up to the root for Vite. By default, create React app has this public URL kind of macro thing. If it's referencing, for example, static assets, that can just go away. So literally just like find and delete and reference the file path. Like it looks like an absolute reference, but it's relative to the public folder. And finally, you'll have to add explicitly add a script tag pointing to the entry point. So with create React app, you have just the root div specified, and like everything is kind of generated on top of that. With this, you're actually adding a module type script and specifying where your index entry point is. And that would be the file that, actually places the app root on the root div. Okay. So this is kind of optional, but I think by default, the index HTML file in Create React App, it comes with these kind of EJS blocks. So I'll show an example here, but basically there's an additional plugin if you want to keep that syntax. So what that looks like is something like this. So there's like these, if else kind of template interpolated things, and so what this is doing here is like conditionally including a script for development environment or for production. And that templating obviously is not part of HTML. So like to get the support for this syntax, you can install this Vite plugin EJS, and then this is the example from their docs. So if you just want to have the default without any data, you just call it as is. Anything you want to specify and have available as like a global variable, you can put a key value here. So if you notice in the syntax here, there's a domain and then a title. So those are getting pulled from the value specified over here. IsDev is something that's provided by default with this plugin. Any questions about that?
So you do you define those values right in that file, or can you use an env file to define these domain titles and whatnot?
Yeah, so this isn't exactly about env variables, but there is a way to basically grab the I'll get back to the env variables if that's the question.
Okay. Okay.
It'll be a separate step.
My question is more around what kind of content goes here and what kind of content goes in env file. Maybe we can talk about when you're talking about env files.
Sure. Yeah, this is kind of a distinct use case. So this is more like if you want that templating syntax. I think actually the next step will be env. So, or actually step 8 will be env. This is a quick thing, but basically Vite will complain if you have any JSX files that contain JS files that contain JSX syntax. So you need to replace any extensions on such files. And then getting back to env vars, so instead of process.env like Create React App uses, Vite will instead read from import.meta.env. So you can literally do like find and replace across your code base. Vite also has like a different convention for the prefix that it uses. So I think with Create React App, every environment variable needs to be prefixed with React App. With Vite, it's Vite underscore. So there's a couple approaches you can take to kind of reuse your existing variables. Obviously, you can rename them all. But that's not ideal if, for example, you have some that are coming from your GitHub or infrastructure. They're not just like in an env file. So the approach that I think is a little bit nicer is you can just update a field in the Vite config to specify what prefix you want instead of the Vite. So just by adding this, you can reuse any existing like React app-based environment variables that you already have. Did that answer your question, Pish?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, and then last step of the general steps. So React script is now no longer used. Essentially, we've replaced all the calls to it in package.json. So you can remove it as a dependency from your project. So to do that, you can like delete the dependency from package.json and then update the installed packages. There's a couple ways to do that. So npm prune is kind of a nice way to remove extraneous packages. It'll just scan your package.json and then basically remove any installed node modules that aren't present there. The kind of brute force way to do this is just delete your node modules and reinstall. They should both work. And now the final step, or after all those kind of anticipated steps is, now you have to get the server to run, and that's the troubleshooting part. So your mileage may vary, as I've cautioned. This will probably be a very complicated step, but it really depends on your project. If it's an early project, it might be quite easy. Personally, in our experience at Markov, we encountered a lot of issues trying to get both the dev server to run and the build to succeed, both. So many, in fact, that we decided that spending additional time was not worthwhile at this point. So I talked to some Catch people who were trying to also migrate to Vite, and they ran into a lot of similar issues with third-party dependencies just not cooperating, and yeah, like there's a lot of error messages that just don't have good solutions yet. Either the error message is very vague, or it's like someone's posted the same thing and it's like a week old and there's just no solution. So that's very frustrating, and at some point you're like, it's not really worth the time that I'm spending. So we'll look at some of those commonly encountered problems that people reported, and then hopefully that can help you decide whether you want to kind of take up the challenge of migrating or not. Because again, there is a pain point, but it's kind of up to you, like how much time to put in. If you're curious, there's some other resources here that kind of outline the steps that I've covered here. Basically, in general, how to migrate. They're not going to go into detail about all the dependencies your project has. So just keep that in mind, but they're quite informative to read over, and there's a YouTube video as well. Okay, so let's talk about some of the obstacles that people face during migration. So there can be many issues that come up when trying to migrate. One thing that's kind of annoying with Vite is you're managing all the plugin stuff yourself, whereas Create React App kind of hides all that stuff from you. It's just giving you like the easy to run commands, and you're not worrying about Webpack configurations and all those things. So you are kind of taking on a lot of responsibility when you move to Vite, and understanding all the plugins, all their configuration options, etc., and making sure those are all working together. One thing to remember is that Vite is pretty young. It was created about exactly 3 years ago. And while the ecosystem is improving, it still feels very nascent compared to Create React App or other tools on the market. A lot of the plugins are also third-party, like just user-created. People just open source them on GitHub. And the documentation is non-existent for some, or just very minimal. So it is kind of tricky navigating all those. I think that awesome Vite list of plugins is a good place to start if you're looking for recommended plugins, but otherwise you're kind of at the mercy of Google and NPM registry. And then, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, finding a solution for the problems that come up, it's often not trivial, and there's a lot of trial and error required to get past the error messages. In my experience, and as well as what I found online, there were a lot of issues stemming from the fact that Vite has different approaches when it's running the dev server versus generating the production build. So some things were working locally that made the production build fail, and vice versa. So that was kind of a source of headache for a lot of people. If you're reading the GitHub threads, there are workarounds that people suggest. for a lot of the issues that come up, but then some are kind of hacky or they're really not ideal in terms of maintaining a long-term solution. So again, it's kind of your call, like whether it's worth it for you to go through all that. And you know, what I would encourage people to do is follow the high-level migration steps. See how far you can get just like troubleshooting on your own. And if it's like you're spending a day or 2 days and you're still running into a lot of issues, then maybe take a step back and say, you know, how much time should we be spending, basically? So let's look at a couple issues that have come up on GitHub and various places on the web. So this was a common issue. I think actually someone from Catch mentioned this to me as like that they were running into. So for example, like when they're trying to build their production app, Vite was just failing, running out of memory on CI. There wasn't really a good solution that people were coming up with. So I think the only solution mentioned in the comments on this page was like boosting up your CI memory. And like, it's not ideal, but you know, it does the job. It's kind of up to you if that's something you want to do. This is from Reddit. So this guy also faced a lot of difficulties. Basically mentioned like a lot of people present it as a very straightforward migration, and it really isn't. So what I've highlighted here is like, for example, Vite expects the component to be the only export in any component file. And this is like not obvious from any guide you see or the documentation itself. This might require restructuring your project completely. I was using React routers, nested routes, and including the loader function in the same file to make the use loader data hook type safe without requiring an import. So like little things like this kind of creep up, and there's many of them. And like if you have to refactor a lot of files, it's kind of a pain in the ass. Some other issues that came up. So I've also found nuances that make the migration painful and undoable for now. We were able to get Jest working, but after getting all the setup files from Create React App essentially in our project, to get Jest working with Vite, we scrapped the migration as it wasn't worth it. Something that seemed to also get missed a lot is for those migrating larger apps. Since Vite is using ES-Build for development and rollup for production, you will run into discrepancies between the two that also cause extra headaches, like I mentioned. I'd like to switch to Vite after more work is done on the dependency bundling / pre-optimization. That right now is the primary blocker, as an app that works in Create React App doesn't work in Vite. If I get it working in a dev build, the production build fails. I love the promise, but I'll give it a few months to bake. Sometimes the dependencies and libraries we are cursed to use are far more cursed. So kind of echoing the same points. Again, like the dev build and the production build are kind of two different tools, and they don't always play nicely. Whereas things just seem to work with Create React App a lot more easily. If people are curious, I've linked here to some additional discussions about migrating. Feel free to like check those out. So let's kind of get to the takeaways now and the so what for everyone here. I think the main takeaway is, you know, always ask yourself, is it worth it, right? And I think, in my opinion, in my experience, what I found is like Vite makes a lot of sense if you're starting a new project. You want a fast build tool. Another consideration, though, is that if your project needs server-side rendering, like Vite is more for a single-page application. Maybe Next.js or Remix would be a better option for those if you're just starting a new project. If you already have a mature application, again, you're going to run into some issues. It may be a non-trivial amount of work, and it may cause a lot of headaches. Just keep that in mind. Many issues can arise in the process, and solutions are not necessarily easy to find. There's going to be trial and error. There's going to be troubleshooting. So I would say, you know, it has to be a problem for you that's significant enough to make it worth all the hassle. So do a cost-benefit analysis of the time trade-off and try to determine how much time you should spend on the migration. So you should ask, like, how much of a pain point is it right now? And keep in mind, like, Create React App is no longer recommended for new projects, but it still works, right? It's not like deprecated, it's not, broken. If it's still working, don't try to fix it, right? Necessarily. So I would recommend doing some profiling of your dev server and build times. Try to determine if it's really a problem, and like if attempting migration would be worth the effort. Again, I think you can go through the high-level steps and then try to see like what comes up after that. And yeah, just to try to give a little bit more concreteness to this question, I should try to answer this question a little bit better. There's a good XKCD comic that I came across a while ago. So it presents this matrix about, so how long should you work on something, work on making a routine task more efficient before you've spent more time than you're saving. And this is kind of averaged across 5 years. So how to read this is like, how often are you doing the task on the top? How much time would you be saving by making it more efficient? And then across 5 years, this is the amount of time you should spend on the thing. So for example, let's say that you're building daily or 5 times a day, something like that. And let's say potentially you're saving 30 seconds at a time. So according to this, you should spend between 12 hours and 3 days maximum. Otherwise, the time savings doesn't make sense. So I thought this was a helpful infographic to include.
You need to add the amount that you have the engineering interest into that thing.
What's that?
You need to add the amount of interest that the developer having to the thing.
The amount of interest?
It's like if you're really eager to work on it, it's going to be faster.
Okay.
It's not really,
So there could be a third axis. Cool. So that's about it, I think. Any final questions people have? Sage, yeah?
Check. So the subtitle for this in my mind at the beginning was why you should use Vite instead of CRA. And by the end of it is why you should not use Vite instead of CRA. So I appreciate you taking us through the good, the bad, and the ugly. One thing that occurred to me while you were talking about the problems was, has anyone tried using eject? So it's basically not a CRA app anymore, but just a Webpack app, and would that change any of the issues as far as you know? I mean, obviously eject is dangerous, so you'd have to like clone it or something, but.
Yeah. So given that the approach is still going to be that bundler, like, here we go, yeah. Like given that Webpack is still going to like follow this, this big bundle approach, I think this, you can probably tweak some things, but you're not going to see the 10x kind of improvement that Vite is promising. So that's possible, but you're kind of like opening a big can of worms. And
Well, I was just wondering if it would solve some of the bugs that happen where you're not able to migrate, not necessarily change the times.
yeah, I'm not sure about that, potentially.
Yeah, basically it just, as far as, I've never done it actually, but as far as I recall, it just opens up like the Webpack config so you can modify it. I mean, that's true.
Cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hold on. I'll get yelled at.
Thanks. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. This may be a stupid question, but could you like pre-bundle using ES-Build with CRA?
Could you pre-bundle?
Or is that like with Vite only, or Vite only?
Yeah, so ES-Build is kind of the alternative to this bundling approach, right? So with the Webpack bundler, your dependent, like your dependencies code and your source code get bundled together. With Vite, they're treated separately, actually. So I think the approach is not really compatible overall. That's an interesting idea, though.
Okay, basically, if you unbundle, if you use ES-build, CRA, the basic, it's not only CRA doesn't do the bundling. There is a lot of transpiling opinionated configurations out there. So we'll be missing from that front. So ES-build is still going to speed up, but CRA is by default opinionated on Webpack. So not sure if it is really feasible without the pain of whatever time frame you showed.
Yeah.
Is that instead of moving to Vite, we can ask CRA, hey, try using ES-build, which Vite uses it, and CRA will still do it. Not sure how much, if a CRA team itself is not doing that, so it's not, I'm not sure how much of worth of an effort that's going to be.
Yeah, good point. Cool. Any other questions? I think that was it.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, thank you guys.